should you get the 6th gen iPod Touch here in 2024? So the iPod Touch 6th generation came out back in 2015, and in this video I'll be explaining to you whether or not you should get this device here 9 years later. So first off, I'll be covering the design and the specs of this iPod Touch, and then I'll go over whether or not it's still worth buying. So first off, with the design, the iPod Touch has just a 4-inch screen from one corner to the other, and this is actually the same size as the iPhone 5, so this device might be hard to get used to. And some of the other features that I like that they included on here is the headphone jack, and it's also one of the thinnest Apple devices ever made. And that's really all there is for the design of the iPod Touch. So let's now talk about the hardware of the iPod Touch. So this device has just 1GB of RAM, and it has the Apple A8 chip. So this device is going to be even slower than the iPhone 6. It's probably about as fast as the iPhone 5S. So if you try to do online gaming or you try to watch YouTube videos on here, it's going to be very hard to do. And as for the storage, the iPod Touch 6th generation has 16, 32, and 64, and also 128GB of storage. So you've got a lot of different storage models to choose from. And that's really all there is for the storage of the iPod Touch. So let's now talk about the battery life of the iPod Touch 6th generation. So the iPod Touch 6 has just 1000 mAh of battery, and just for comparison, some of the later iPhones like the iPhone 15 Pro have about 3500 mAh, and especially because you're probably going to get this device used, the battery life is going to be really short on here. And that's really all there is to cover for the battery of the iPod Touch. Let's now move on to the camera. So let's first off go over the specs of the camera before we actually do a photo and a video test on here. So the rear camera on this device can take up to 8 megapixel photos, and it could also take up to 1080p video. And as for the front camera, it could take 1.2 megapixel photos and 720p video. So let's now do an actual photo and a video test with both cameras. So starting off with a photo test, here's what the rear camera photo looks like on the iPod Touch. So just pause the video if you need to. And then just for comparison, here it is on the iPhone 14 Pro. And let's now move on to the video test. So here's what video looks like on the iPod Touch 6th generation. And let's try focusing on this other device so that you can see the details. And here's basically what that video looks like. And let's now compare that to the iPhone 14 Pro. So here's what video looks like on the iPhone 14 Pro. And let's try focusing on the background again. And let's now try out the video quality with a front camera. And now with the front camera, here's a photo test with the iPod Touch. So just pause the video if you need to. And for comparison, here it is on the iPhone 14 Pro. So let's now move on to a video test with both of these devices. So here's what the front camera looks like on the iPod Touch. And the camera quality is not that good. It's good enough for FaceTiming, but the video on here is nothing that you'd want to use for social media. Now here's what the video looks like on the iPhone 14 Pro with the front camera, and it's definitely a huge difference. And that's really all there is for the camera of the iPod Touch. Let's now talk about the battery life. And let's now talk about the screen resolution with the iPod Touch. So like I mentioned earlier, it does have a 4-inch screen from one corner to the other, so it is going to be very small. And the screen resolution is 640 by 568, and even though the screen resolution is very low, because the screen is so tiny, it's not going to be really noticeable, so the screen quality is nothing to worry about on the iPod Touch. So the last thing we need to cover before we talk about whether or not it's still worth buying is the software support. So the iPod Touch 6th generation only goes up to iOS 12.5.7, so you're not going to be getting the latest iOS updates. And this device hasn't gotten the latest iOS updates ever since around 2019 or 2020, so you're not going to be getting the latest features on here. But that's basically it for the specs of the iPod Touch. Let's now talk about whether or not it's still worth buying. So my recommendation for you is to not get this iPod, and my reason for that is, first off, if you plan on just using it as a music player, you could get one for much cheaper by getting the 5th generation instead, which works just as well for music. But if you want to actually be able to use internet on here, then I would recommend getting the iPhone instead. So for the same price as the 6th generation iPod Touch, you could get an iPhone 8, which is about $60. So definitely don't get the iPod Touch if you want to use it for internet. So I definitely don't recommend getting an iPod Touch. Just get an older iPhone, and I'll have all my iPhone reviews linked down below, so make sure to check them out if you're interested. So that's all there is for the iPod Touch review. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.